Chapter 1. The Gilded Cage. Julian Thorne lived in a fortress of money. His world was one of polished marble, silent servants, and a view of the city that stretched to the horizon, a glittering tapestry woven from the threads of his father's empire. The penthouse was a masterpiece of minimalist design, all sharp angles, cold glass, and priceless art that no one ever seemed to actually look at. It was a museum, and Julian was its most carefully preserved, yet neglected exhibit. At 24, his life was a study in contradiction. He was the sole heir to Thorne Global, a conglomerate so vast its tendrils touched every continent. Yet he couldn't walk to the bathroom without help. A rare, degenerative neuromuscular disease had been his unwelcome companion since adolescence, steadily stealing his strength, confining him first to a cane, then to a state-of-the-art, titanium-framed wheelchair that cost more than a luxury car. It could climb curbs, navigate rough terrain, and interface with every smart device in the penthouse. But it couldn't give him back his legs, couldn't give him back his life. His father, Alistair Thorne, was a man carved from granite and ambition. He saw Julian's condition not as a tragedy to be mourned, but as a problem to be solved, a flaw in the Thorne legacy to be managed. His solution was to throw money at it. The best doctors, the most advanced equipment, a fleet of private nurses. But he rarely threw his time, his attention, or his empathy. "We're flying to Zurich on Thursday, Julian," Alistair announced one evening, not looking up from his tablet as he scanned a quarterly report. "There's a new clinic there, pioneering a radical gene therapy. Dr. Feldman is a genius." Julian stared out at the sunset, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The last genius in Singapore said he could reverse the degeneration. All he reversed was $2 million from your account into his. Chapter 1. The Gilded Cage. Julian Thorne lived in a fortress of money. His world was one of polished marble, silent servants, and a view of the city that stretched to the horizon, a glittering tapestry woven from the threads of his father's empire. The penthouse was a masterpiece of minimalist design, all sharp angles, cold glass, and priceless art that no one ever seemed to actually look at. It was a museum, and Julian was its most carefully preserved, yet neglected exhibit. At 24, his life was a study in contradiction. He was the sole heir to Thorne Global, a conglomerate so vast its tendrils touched every continent. Yet he couldn't walk to the bathroom without help. A rare, degenerative neuromuscular disease had been his unwelcome companion since adolescence, steadily stealing his strength, confining him first to a cane, then to a state-of-the-art, titanium-framed wheelchair that cost more than a luxury car. It could climb curbs, navigate rough terrain, and interface with every smart device in the penthouse. But it couldn't give him back his legs, couldn't give him back his life. His father, Alistair Thorne, was a man carved from granite and ambition. He saw Julian's condition not as a tragedy to be mourned, but as a problem to be solved, a flaw in the Thorne legacy to be managed. His solution was to throw money at it. The best doctors, the most advanced equipment, a fleet of private nurses. But he rarely threw his time, his attention, or his empathy. "We're flying to Zurich on Thursday, Julian," Alistair announced one evening, not looking up from his tablet as he scanned a quarterly report. "There's a new clinic there, pioneering a radical gene therapy. Dr. Feldman is a genius." Julian stared out at the sunset, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The last genius in Singapore said he could reverse the degeneration. All he reversed was $2 million from your account into his. His eyes like chips of flint. "This weakness, this surrender, it's not in our blood. Our blood." The phrase was a knife twist. Julian's mother, Eleanor, had had the same fiery spirit Alistair now derided as weakness. She had been the one to read him adventure stories, to fill his head with tales of knights and explorers. She had died in a car accident when Julian was 10, and with her all the warmth had bled from the Thorne world. Her memory was another exhibit in the museum, a beautiful, sad portrait in the West Wing, spoken of in hushed tones. "I'm tired of fighting," Julian said softly, turning his wheelchair away from the view. "I'm just tired." The upcoming trip to a remote, luxurious wellness retreat in the English countryside was Alistair's latest gambit. A week of grounding and nature therapy with a renowned and notoriously expensive life coach named Soren. Julian knew it was nonsense. Another performance where he, the crippled son, would play his part, the reluctant participant who would, through the sheer force of his father's will and Soren's platitudes, have a breakthrough. He'd already decided he wouldn't. He was an expert in the art of passive resistance. Chapter 2. The Unraveling. The retreat was, of course, breathtaking. A converted manor house nestled in the rolling hills of the Cotswolds, all honey-colored stone and sprawling, manicured gardens that gave way to wild, ancient woodland. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming roses. For the other guests, CEOs, celebrities, and trust fund babies, it was a paradise. For Julian, it was just another gilded cage with a different view. Soren, a man with a disturbingly intense gaze and a penchant for white linen, began his work immediately. Group sessions involved sharing feelings on a giant, silk cushion. Julian remained silent. Meditations were held by a babbling brook. Julian used the time to plan the scathing memoir he would never write. The tension between father and son crackled in the idyllic setting. Alistair was frustrated by Julian's obstinance. Julian was suffocated by his father's presence. The breaking point came on the third day. It was after a particularly grating session where Soren had tried to get Julian to visualize his legs filled with healing, white light. Julian, his patience frayed to nothing, had snapped. "I can visualize a unicorn tap dancing on the moon, Soren. It doesn't make it real." Alistair, humiliated, followed him out onto the terrace. "Must you be so deliberately difficult? So rude? Must you be so deliberately delusional?" Julian shot back, his voice low and venomous. "This isn't for me. This is for you. So you can tell yourself you did everything you could for your broken son. Well, congratulations. You've done it. Now leave me alone. You think this is easy for me?" Alistair's composure shattered. "To see you like this? To see my legacy wasting away in that chair." "There it is," Julian whispered, a bitter smile on his lips. "The legacy. It was always about the legacy." He didn't wait for a reply. He spun his wheelchair around and headed for the path that led away from the manor, down towards the woods. The path was marked as a gentle, accessible trail. But Julian wasn't looking for gentleness. He was looking for escape. He pushed the joystick forward, the electric motor whirring softly as he picked up speed. The manicured lawns gave way to rougher ground. The sky, which had been a clear blue, was now gathering ominous gray clouds. A cold wind whispered through the trees, a stark contrast to the morning's warmth. He didn't care. The anger was a fire in his veins, hotter than any illness. He followed a narrower track, one that dove deeper into the woods. The sign said unsuitable for vehicles, but he ignored it. His chair could handle it. It had to. The first drops of rain were heavy and cold. They splattered against his face, his expensive cashmere sweater. Soon, it was a deluge, a relentless, soaking rain that turned the world gray and blurred the edges of the path. The dirt beneath his wheels, once firm, began to soften. Panic, cold and sharp, began to cut through his anger. He tried to turn back, but the path was too narrow. His front wheels slid in the mud. He pushed the joystick again, but the wheels only spun, churning the earth into a deeper, thicker slurry. The sophisticated sensors began to beep in alarm. Traction loss. Motor strain. "No," he muttered, jamming the controls. "No, no, no." The chair lurched, one wheel sinking deep into a hidden rut. The motor whined, a high-pitched scream of protest, and then died. The control panel flickered and went dark. A final, apologetic beep. System failure. He was stuck, utterly and completely. The rain poured down, plastering his hair to his forehead, soaking him to the bone. The mud was already oozing over his footrests, cold and thick. He was in the middle of nowhere in a dead $1 million chair, invisible to the world. He fumbled for his phone. No signal. The towering trees and the storm had seen to that. For a long time, he just sat there, the rain and his own despair mingling on his face. He screamed for help, but his voice was swallowed by the howling wind and the drumming rain. This was it. This was how the great Julian Thorne, heir to a billion-dollar empire, would meet his end, sinking slowly into the mud, alone and forgotten. The irony was so perfect it was cruel. He had spent his life feeling trapped, and now nature itself had become his final prison. He closed his eyes, the fight finally gone out of him, and surrendered to the cold and the dark. Chapter 3: A Different Kind of Strength. The sound was faint at first, a squelching rhythm cutting through the white noise of the rain. It was the sound of boots, steady and purposeful. Julian's eyes flew open. A figure emerged from the gray curtain of rain, a silhouette against the dripping trees. As it drew closer, he saw it was a woman. She was tall and sturdy, wrapped in a worn, practical waxed cotton coat, its green color faded by sun and storm. A headscarf, vibrant with a pattern of gold and maroon, was tied neatly around her head, protecting her from the weather. In one hand, she carried a stout walking stick. In the other, a woven basket filled with wild mushrooms and damp kindling. She stopped a few feet away, her dark, intelligent eyes taking in the scene. The expensive, feudal wheelchair, the trapped young man, the mud claiming him inch by inch. Her face was unreadable, weathered by a life he could only imagine. Julian felt a hot flush of shame. This was a spectacle. A rich idiot who'd gotten himself stuck. "Are you all right?" Her voice was low and melodic, carrying a soft local accent. It wasn't laced with pity or alarm. It was a simple, practical question. "Do I look all right?" He snapped, the last vestiges of his pride making him defensive. She didn't flinch. She just looked at him, her gaze steady. "You look stuck," she stated simply. "And cold." She walked around him, assessing the situation with the calm expertise of a mechanic looking at a broken engine. She prodded the mud with her stick, tested the chair's frame. "This thing's heavy," she murmured. "Won't be pulling it out. We'll have to get you out first." The word felt foreign. "I can't," Julian said, the admission tasting like ash. "I can't walk." "I can see that," she said, not unkindly. "Name's Cora Bell. I live just down the way." She pointed with her stick towards a direction that seemed to be nothing but more trees and mud. She set her basket and stick down on a relatively dry patch under a large oak. Then, without a word of warning, she stepped into the mud beside him. It swallowed her boots up to the ankles. She was close now, and he could see the fine lines around her eyes, the strength in her hands, the quiet dignity in her posture. "Now," she said, her voice firm, "you're going to have to help me. Put your arm around my shoulders." Julian stared at her, incredulous. "You can't be serious. You'll never. I'm too heavy." A faint smile touched her lips. "Son, I've hauled sheep out of bogs twice as deep. You're not as heavy as a ewe in lamb. Now, do you want to sit here and freeze? Or do you want to try?" Something in her tone, the utter lack of doubt, brooked no argument. Hesitantly, he lifted his arm. It was a weak, trembling limb, a source of constant frustration. He looped it over her shoulders. She didn't stagger. She braced herself, her body solid and unyielding as an oak root. "On 3, she instructed. 1, 2, 3, she heaved. Julian tried to push with his one functioning leg, a pathetic, scrambling motion. For a terrifying second, he thought they would both topple over into the mud. But Cora's balance was perfect. She shifted her weight, grunting with the effort, and with a great, sucking sound, he was pulled free from the chair's clutches. His legs, useless and numb, dragged behind him like dead weights. His entire weight was on her, and she bore it without a flinch. She half carried, half dragged him to the oak tree, leaning him against the massive trunk while she caught her breath. Her face was beaded with rain and sweat, but her expression was one of pure, uncomplicated triumph. "Right?" she said, picking up her stick and basket. "Home's not far. It's this way." She didn't wait for his permission. She simply got him moving again, her body a crutch, her will a force of nature. They moved in a slow, awkward shuffle through the woods. Julian, in a daze of cold and shock, could only focus on putting one foot in front of the other, on the solid, unwavering presence of the woman beside him. This poor black woman, appearing out of the storm, had done the first unthinkable thing. She had lifted a billionaire's son from the mud without asking for a thing. Chapter 4. The Hearth. Cora's home was not what Julian expected. It wasn't a picturesque cottage, but a small, stone-built crofter's house that looked as if it had grown from the land itself. Smoke curled from a single chimney, a welcoming signal in the gloom. A small, meticulously kept vegetable garden lay to one side, and a few chickens clucked unhappily from their coop. She got him up the single step and through the low door, into a space that was the absolute antithesis of his penthouse. It was warm, first and foremost. A small, cast-iron wood stove glowed in the hearth, filling the single room with a dry, comforting heat. The air smelled of wood smoke, drying herbs, and baking bread. The room was cluttered but clean. Books were stacked on a rough-hewn shelf, alongside jars of preserves and well-worn tools. A simple bed was tucked in one corner, covered with a hand-stitched quilt. Dried flowers hung from the beams. It was a home that was lived in, loved in. It had a soul. Cora guided him to a worn but sturdy armchair by the fire and draped a thick, woolen blanket over his shivering shoulders. "Right," she said, her practical tone returning. "Let's get you out of those wet things." Before he could protest, she was helping him peel off the soaking cashmere sweater and his wet trousers, moving with a brisk, maternal efficiency that stripped the moment of any awkwardness. She gave him a pair of soft, flannel pajama bottoms and a thick wool sweater that, while old, was clean and warm. "These were my husband's, Elijah," she said, a quiet note in her voice. "They'll be big on you, but they're dry." She settled him back in the chair, then bustled about, stoking the fire, putting a kettle on the stove top. She didn't fuss over him or ask a barrage of questions. She simply let him be, allowing the warmth and the silence to do their work. Julian watched her, the shock beginning to recede, replaced by a profound, bewildering sense of calm. He had never been in a place like this. There was no noise, except for the crackle of the fire and the whistle of the kettle. No demands, no expectations. He was just a cold, wet man being warmed by a fire. She brought him a mug of strong, sweet tea. "Drink that. It'll help with the shock." He took it, his hands trembling slightly around the warm china. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling inadequate. "My chair, my phone, my father will be." "All of that can wait," Cora said, pulling up a wooden stool and sitting opposite him. "The storm will pass. The mud will hold your chair hostage for a while longer. And your father, well, he'll either be worried or angry, but he's not here right now. You are. And you're safe." Her words were a balm. For the first time in a decade, someone had taken charge not to manage him or fix him or mold him into an acceptable version of a son, but simply to care for him. It was the second unthinkable thing. "I'm Julian," he said finally. "I know," Cora replied, a knowing glint in her eye. "Saw it in the paper last week. Thorne Global. Your father's buying up the land over the hill. Caused quite a stir." Julian winced. Of course. Even here, in this sanctuary, his name came with baggage. Cora saw his expression. "Don't you worry. Your name and your money mean nothing in this house. Here, you're just a young man who got caught in the rain." She served him a simple meal of vegetable soup from a pot that seemed to be perpetually on the stove, and thick slices of fresh, crusty bread with butter. It was the most delicious food he had ever tasted. Tasted real. As the evening drew in and the storm raged outside, Julian found himself talking. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the warmth, the safety, the non-judgmental silence she offered. He told her about his mother. He told her about the diagnosis. He spoke of the endless parades of doctors, the false hopes, the crushing disappointments. He talked about his father's cold ambition, the feeling of being a ghost in his own life, a placeholder for a legacy he didn't want and couldn't fulfill. Cora listened. She didn't offer platitudes or advice. She just listened, her hands busy mending a tear in a work shirt, her presence a quiet anchor. When he finally fell silent, exhausted and emotionally raw, she spoke. "My Elijah," she began, her eyes on the fire, "was a carpenter, best hands in the county. Lost the use of his right arm in a sawmill accident when he was 40. The doctors said he'd never work again." She smiled, a distant, fond look on her face. He was a proud man. That loss, it near broke him. He sank into a mud of his own making for a good long while. Anger, self-pity, the whole lot. She looked at Julian. Took him a year to realize he still had his left arm, and his eyes and his mind. He learned to draw his designs with his left hand. He taught me to be his second pair of hands. We started making smaller things, toys, jewelry boxes, intricate carvings. They weren't the great tables and dressers he used to make, but they were beautiful, and they were ours. He didn't get back what he lost. He found something new. She stood up, brushing off her lap. "The world will tell you what you can't do, Julian. It's your job to find out what you can, even if it's small, even if it's just getting through the day without letting the bitterness win. Now you should rest." She helped him to the bed, insisting he take it while she made a pallet for herself by the fire. Lying in the simple bed, under the heavy quilt, listening to the rain on the roof and the soft sounds of Cora settling in for the night, Julian felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt peace, and he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that the woman by the fire possessed a kind of wealth his father could never comprehend. Chapter 5: The Search. Back at the retreat, chaos had erupted. Alistair Thorne was a man used to control, and the disappearance of his son was an unacceptable lapse. The storm had grounded helicopters, and the local search and rescue teams, though diligent, were struggling with the conditions. Alistair was pacing the library, his phone pressed to his ear, barking orders to his security team in London. "I don't care about the storm. Get a team here now. Scan every satellite image, access every traffic camera in a 50-mile radius." Soren tried to calm him. "Alistair, perhaps this is part of his process. A rebellion against the structures that bind him." "He's in a wheelchair in a thunderstorm, you fool," Alistair roared, his fear manifesting as rage. "This isn't a process. It's a catastrophe." He imagined the headlines, the pitying looks, the failure. But beneath the icy veneer of the Billionaire, a flicker of something else, primal paternal fear, was trying to break through. He saw Eleanor's face in his mind, and a cold dread wrapped around his heart. He had failed her. He was failing their son. Hours passed with no news. The search parties returned, soaked and empty-handed. The storm began to abate, leaving a bruised, dripping world in its wake. As dawn broke, a local farmer, who had been out checking on his flocks, mentioned to one of the searchers that he'd seen Cora Bell heading into the woods with a stranger the previous evening. It was the first lead. Alistair, accompanied by 2 retreat staff, immediately set off in the direction the farmer indicated. He pictured some derelict hovel, some opportunistic local holding his son for ransom. His mind, trained in the art of worst-case scenarios, ran through a dozen grim possibilities. Chapter 6: The Unthinkable. They found the wheelchair first. It was a pathetic sight, half submerged in mud, a monument to technological arrogance defeated by simple earth. Alistair's breath caught in his throat. It was empty. A few hundred yards further, they saw the cottage. Smoke curled from the chimney. As they approached the gate, the door opened and Cora stepped out, holding a bucket of vegetable peelings for the compost. She saw the group of men and paused, her expression unreadable. Alistair strode forward, his expensive boots sinking into the mud of her yard. "Where is my son?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the morning air. Cora looked him up and down, from his tailored jacket to his mud-caked trousers. She didn't seem impressed. "He's inside. He's safe. I'll be the judge of that." Alistair moved to push past her, but she stood her ground, a slight figure blocking the doorway. "He's sleeping," she said, her voice low but firm. "He had a long night. You can wait." Alistair was dumbstruck. No one told him to wait. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "I do," Cora replied evenly. "You're the man who let his son roll off into a storm. In my house, that makes you someone who can wait on the doorstep until I say otherwise." The retreat staff exchanged stunned glances. No one spoke to Alistair Thorne like that. Just then, Julian appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily on the doorframe. He was wearing the flannel pajamas and oversized sweater. He looked pale, tired, but his eyes were clear. They held a calmness Alistair hadn't seen in years. "Father," Julian said. His voice was quiet, but it held a new strength. "Julian, thank God." Alistair's relief was palpable, quickly morphing back into command. "Let's go. The car is waiting. We'll get you to a hospital, get you checked out." Julian didn't move. "I'm fine." "You are not fine. You're standing in a doorway in pajamas." Alistair's gaze swept over the humble cottage, the simple woman. "We're leaving. Now, I'll make it worth your while, Ms. Bell, for your assistance." He reached for his checkbook, the ultimate tool of dismissal and transaction. It was then that Cora did the unthinkable. She laughed. It wasn't a loud, mocking laugh, but a soft, incredulous sound that held a universe of pity. She looked from the checkbook to Alistair's face, and she shook her head. "You really don't see, do you?" she said. "You think everything has a price. Your son's health has a price. My assistance has a price." She stepped closer to him, her voice dropping, but gaining intensity. "What is the price for a good night's sleep, Mr. Thorne? What is the price for a quiet mind? What is the price for a bowl of soup when you're cold and hungry, given without any thought of what you can give in return?" Alistair was speechless. He stood, checkbook in hand, utterly disarmed. "Your son wasn't just stuck in the mud out there," Cora continued, her eyes locking with his. "He's been stuck in it for years. Stuck in your expectations, your money, your disappointment." "I do," Cora replied evenly. "You're the man who let his son roll off into a storm. In my house, that makes you someone who can wait on the doorstep until I say otherwise." The retreat staff exchanged stunned glances. No one spoke to Alistair Thorne like that. Just then, Julian appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily on the doorframe. He was wearing the flannel pajamas and oversized sweater. He looked pale, tired, but his eyes were clear. They held a calmness Alistair hadn't seen in years. "Father," Julian said. His voice was quiet, but it held a new strength. "Julian, thank God." Alistair's relief was palpable, quickly morphing back into command. "Let's go. The car is waiting. We'll get you to a hospital, get you checked out." Julian didn't move. "I'm fine." "You are not fine. You're standing in a doorway in pajamas." Alistair's gaze swept over the humble cottage, the simple woman. "We're leaving. Now, I'll make it worth your while, Ms. Bell, for your assistance." He reached for his checkbook, the ultimate tool of dismissal and transaction. It was then that Cora did the unthinkable. She laughed. It wasn't a loud, mocking laugh, but a soft, incredulous sound that held a universe of pity. She looked from the checkbook to Alistair's face, and she shook her head. "You really don't see, do you?" she said. "You think everything has a price. Your son's health has a price. My assistance has a price." She stepped closer to him, her voice dropping, but gaining intensity. "What is the price for a good night's sleep, Mr. Thorne? What is the price for a quiet mind? What is the price for a bowl of soup when you're cold and hungry, given without any thought of what you can give in return?" Alistair was speechless. He stood, checkbook in hand, utterly disarmed. "Your son wasn't just stuck in the mud out there," Cora continued, her eyes locking with his. "He's been stuck in it for years. Stuck in your expectations, your money, your disappointment. I didn't just pull him from a ditch. I offered him a chair by a fire and a listening ear. And that, sir, is not for sale." She turned and went back inside, leaving Alistair standing in the mud, her words hanging in the air like a challenge. Julian looked at his father, truly looked at him. He saw the confusion, the fear beneath the anger. He saw a man who was, in his own way, just as trapped as he was. "She's right, father," Julian said softly. "I'm not going with you. Not yet." Alistair's head snapped up. "What?" "I'm staying here. For a little while. Don't be absurd. This hovel? This woman. This woman has shown me more kindness in one night than I've known in a decade," Julian said, his voice gaining conviction. "She sees me, father. Not the chair. Not the heir. Me. And I need to remember what that feels like." The argument that followed was fierce but quiet. Alistair threatened, pleaded, and reasoned. Julian stood his ground. For the first time, his refusal wasn't born of petulant rebellion, but of a quiet, unshakable certainty. He had found something here, a piece of himself he thought was lost, and he wasn't ready to let it go. In the end, defeated not by his son's anger but by his resolve, Alistair left. He walked away from the cottage, a billionaire who had just discovered the limits of his power, his checkbook useless in the face of a truth he couldn't buy. Chapter 7: The Weaving. Julian stayed with Cora for a week. It was a week that fundamentally altered the course of his life. He learned the rhythm of her days. He woke with the sun, to the sound of birds and the crackle of the fire being stoked. He couldn't do physical chores, but Cora found things for him. He sorted her dried herbs, labeling the jars in his neat, architect-trained handwriting. He read to her in the evenings from her small collection of poetry books, his voice growing stronger each day. He watched her work. She was a weaver. In a small loom set up by the window, she created tapestries and cloth of stunning beauty. They were not perfect, machine-made things. They were alive with color and texture, telling stories of the land, the sky, the woods. She taught him about the dyes she made from plants, the goldenrod for yellow, the madder root for red, the walnut hulls for deep brown. "It's alchemy," she said, showing him a simmering pot of purple dye made from lichen, taking the ordinary and finding the magic within. One afternoon, she placed a basket of colorful wool scraps on his lap. "Your hands still work," she said. "Your mind still works. So make something." He stared at the wool. "What?" "Anything. A mess. A truth. A feeling. Just make." Hesitantly, he began to sort the colors. He had once been a gifted draftsman, with dreams of being an architect. He had loved the feel of a pencil on vellum, the act of creation. That had been stolen from him, along with everything else. His hands, which once drew soaring structures, now felt clumsy and useless. But under Cora's patient, non-judgmental eye, he began to weave the scraps together on a small handheld loom. It was awkward at first. The pattern was chaotic, a jumble of color. But as his fingers remembered the joy of creation, the chaos began to take shape. He wasn't building a skyscraper, but he was building something. A small, humble square of cloth. It was lumpy and imperfect, but it was his. In that simple act, something broke open inside him. The bitterness, the self-pity, the crushing sense of futility. It began to loosen its grip. He was still disabled. That reality hadn't changed. But his relationship to it had. He wasn't just a body that was broken. He was a mind that could still imagine, and hands that could still create, even if in a new, different way. He and Cora talked for hours. He learned about her life with Elijah, their struggles and their profound happiness. She asked him about his dreams, the ones he'd had before the illness. "I wanted to build things," he confessed, looking at the small tapestry in his hands. "Not just buildings. Communities. Spaces where people could feel, well, feel like I feel in this cottage. Safe. Whole." "Then why can't you?" Cora asked simply. The question hung in the air, not as a challenge, but as a genuine inquiry. And for the first time, Julian didn't have a ready-made answer about his health, his father, his limitations. He just had the question, and the quiet, burgeoning belief that maybe, just maybe, he could. Chapter 8: The Return. When Alistair's car returned a week later, It was at Julian's request. He was ready to go back, but he was not the same man who had left. He was waiting outside the cottage, sitting in a sturdy, old-fashioned wooden wheelchair Cora had borrowed from a neighbor. His own high-tech chair was being cleaned and repaired in the village. He was dressed in his own clothes, now clean and dry, but he held the small, woven square he had made tightly in his hand. Alistair got out of the car. He looked older, the lines on his face deeper. The confrontation with Cora had humbled him in a way no business failure ever could. "Julian," he said, his voice cautious. "Father." There was a long silence. The air between them was different. The old script of conflict and control had been burned away. I owe you an apology," Alistair said, the words clearly foreign and difficult on his tongue. "And I owe that woman a debt I can never repay." Julian nodded. "Her name is Cora, and the debt is mine. But she wouldn't see it that way." He looked back at the cottage, at Cora standing in the doorway. She gave him a small, warm smile and a nod. It was a benediction. As the driver helped Julian into the car, Alistair hesitated, then walked over to Cora. He didn't pull out his checkbook. "Ms. Bell," he began, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. "Thank you." Cora looked at him, her gaze penetrating. "He's a good man, Alistair Thorne. You just have to get out of his way long enough to see it. And he's more than his father's son. He's his mother's son, too. Remember that." Alistair flinched, but nodded. It was a truth he had long avoided. Chapter 9. A New Foundation. Life in the penthouse was different upon their return. The silence was no longer cold, but contemplative. Alistair stopped scheduling doctors and life coaches. He started listening. Julian, for his part, was a man with a purpose. He set up a design studio in a sun-filled room of the penthouse. On a large table, he began sketching, not with a computer, but with pencil and paper. He drew designs for accessible housing, not as sterile, hospital-like units, but as beautiful, integrated homes where people of all abilities could live with dignity and joy. He incorporated principles of nature, light, and community, ideas he had absorbed in Cora's cottage. He reached out to his old university, to organizations specializing in disability advocacy and design. He used his name and his money, not as a shield, but as a tool. The Julian Thorne Foundation for Inclusive Design was born. He sent Cora a package. It contained the first prototype of a tactile, beautifully designed grab bar, something that looked more like a piece of sculptural art than a medical aid. He also sent her a photograph of his first architectural model, a community center that was both fully accessible and breathtakingly beautiful. The note simply read, "I'm building. Thank you for showing me how." Weeks turned into months. Alistair watched his son's transformation with a sense of awe. The sullen, bitter young man was gone, replaced by a driven, passionate visionary. One evening, Alistair came into Julian's studio. He looked at the intricate models, the detailed sketches. "This is remarkable, Julian," he said, and he meant it. "It's a start," Julian said, not looking up from his drawing. "I was wrong," Alistair said, the admission easier this time. "About everything. I thought strength was about fighting the illness, about conquering it. I see now that real strength is about living with it and living well. She taught you that." "She taught us both," Julian replied, finally meeting his father's gaze. A tentative bridge was being built between them, not on the foundation of a cure, but on the foundation of mutual respect. Chapter 10. The Legacy. A year later, on a crisp autumn day, a car pulled up outside Cora's cottage. Julian got out, moving confidently on a pair of advanced carbon fiber crutches. His disease was still progressing, but his spirit was stronger than ever. He walked into the cottage, which was filled with the golden light of the afternoon. Cora was at her loom, but she wasn't alone. Sitting with her, sharing a pot of tea, was Alistair Thorne. It was a sight Julian never could have imagined. His father, in his Seville row suit, looking completely at ease on a rough-hewn wooden stool, listening intently as Cora explained the pattern she was weaving. "Julian," Cora said, her face breaking into a warm smile. "Cora, father, I see you've started without me. Your father was just telling me about the new foundations project in London, Cora said. It sounds wonderful. Alistair looked at his son, and there was pride in his eyes. Real, unadulterated pride. It is wonderful. It's going to change lives. Julian sat down, accepting a cup of tea. He looked around the humble cottage, the heart of his transformation. He had sunk into the mud, both literally and figuratively, and had been ready to be swallowed by it. But a poor black woman had appeared, a woman the world would deem having nothing, and she had done the unthinkable. She had not pulled him out for money or for fame or for any reason other than it was the right thing to do. She had offered him the simple, profound gifts of compassion, dignity, and a quiet belief in his worth. She had shown him that his value was not in his legs, but in his heart and his mind. And in doing so, she had not only saved a life. She had set in motion a legacy of healing and creation that would far outlast any corporate empire. The real unthinkable act was not the rescue from the mud, but the restoration of a soul. And as the three of them sat together in the warm, firelit cottage, the billionaire, his son, and the weaver, the air was thick with the unspoken understanding that the greatest wealth in the world was not measured in dollars, but in the courage to be kind and the strength to begin again.